Alright, what is going on, everyone? First and foremost, I want to say thank you for being here right now, watching this video. I do really appreciate your time, and I would really appreciate if you do consider subscribing, because it truly does help me out a lot. Now, we're going to be reacting to the worst Dan Schneider crimes. Quiet on set, pretty much blurred, if you get what I mean. Overall, they did a great job trying to, expose as much as they can. You get what I mean? They did a great job overall, but since it's on TV and things like that, I'm pretty sure. So it's just like, they have their limits, if you get what I mean. They have their limits, their boundaries, and they can't really expose every single thing. But in this video, pretty sure, they dive into what Quiet on Set couldn't really get into, if you get what I mean. So without further ado, let's just play the video and see what it's talking about.
Quiet on Set exposed a ton of disgusting things about Nickelodeon and Dan Schneider. But did you know there were so many things they had to leave out for a variety of reasons? The producers of the documentary had to rely on people who were willing to go on the record, and a ton of people who could speak out are legitimately scared for their careers. And that's where we come in. Because since we aren't airing on national television, I can get into all sorts of things that Quiet on Set couldn't even touch. While yes, some of these revelations are based in speculation or rumors, some of them have been corroborated and openly discussed by people who were there. And most of this stuff is way more outrageous than what was covered in the documentary. So let's get into the full story of what really happened to these victims of Dan Schneider and Nickelodeon. Dan Schneider produced and wrote some of the most impactful kids shows of the last 3 decades, like iCarly, Victorious, The Amanda Show, all that, Drake and Josh, and more. But by pretending to be this faux father figure to the vulnerable child stars on his sets, he's molded his protege's brains to make them susceptible to not only his fantasies, but the sexual fantasies of his creepy friends and even some colleagues on set. And his reach even spread beyond the child actors. He was fulfilling his fantasies through the kids at home who watched the shows. That sounds wild and dark, I know, but the evidence is all there. The subliminal messages, the court cases, the hush money, the psychology behind it all, the feet, so many feet, and even the bombshells so huge Nickelodeon's been forking out money to silence them for years. Like multiple pregnancy scandals. And it all starts with Dan's first golden child and victim, the purest example of Dan's desire to be both a dark father figure and an exploitative admirer, Amanda Bynes. Before we go any further, I need you to keep in mind as we go through this roller coaster of disgust that this is how young Amanda was the first time a 30-year-old Dan scouted her in one of these creepy comedy showcases for children. Initially, Dan hadn't intended to add any new talent to his current show, all that, but as soon as he saw Amanda, he was obsessed.
Is God sitting up there in heaven looking down at me and saying, Amanda's had it pretty easy?
He quickly put her on his show and immediately began showcasing an intense favoritism and unsettling obsession with his newest protege.
There would be times where Amanda would just be missing. And a lot of times we would just hear that she would be with Dan.
You have to remember, Dan was the dream maker for all these young...
I'm not gonna lie, you gotta realize this girl in this video is not also not gonna say certain things, you get what I mean? I understand she's trying to keep things as clean as possible, you get what I mean? But bro, when they're saying Amanda was behind the scenes and whatnot, spending how much time, I don't even know how much time with Dan Schneider, the weirdo, you get what I mean? You can only picture in your head what was actually going on. So you get what I mean? It's just like you got to use your brain and think about that one, because the girl in this video isn't really gonna dig too deep into that. But overall, Amanda as well. Amanda hasn't come out and said this is what Dan Schneider has done to me, or did these certain things to me. So it's just like she's pretty much went on a hiatus, if you get what I mean. So there's no actual proof. But it's like when you see Dan Schneider spending how much time with Amanda and all these things, right? You gotta use your head and think, bro. There's only one thing that he could have been doing behind the scenes, man.
Aspiring stars, but most of these kids didn't get the Star is Born plucked from a comedy stage moment. They had to go through rounds and rounds of casting that had creepy elements themselves. We'll get back to those. Or for some others, they'd have to rise through the ranks at Dan's notorious child comedy boot camps. And yes, it gets immediately creepy, because these comedy boot camps, where kids were sent without their parents, not only were they run by Dan and special guests like convicted pedophile Brian Peck, who we'll get back to, but also these comedy boot camps, for some reason, entailed regular kid-only pool parties. That's right, no parents, just grown men and a bunch of very young Hollywood hopefuls in bathing suits. It's been said that Megan Fox and Hilary Duff both got their big breaks from these creepy pool parties too. I mean, it certainly adds an ick factor to the hot tub interviews on The Amanda Show, where a preteen Amanda Bynes in a bathing suit hung out with adult characters, frequently men, in a hot tub. Of course, this recurring segment was created by Dan. He loves putting kids in these adult situations where even a grown woman would be objectified. But not only was he writing these sketches for fictional characters, he wrote himself into an interview and openly bragged about his power over the whole situation.
Now, you're the executive producer of the show.
Yes, I'm the executive producer and the head writer.
You actually wrote the words we're saying to each other right now.
Yes, I wrote this whole conversation that we're having right now.
And that's one thing that's important to remember about Dan. Unlike some showrunners who write and produce in the background, Dan wanted to be seen as the mastermind behind these shows. I mean, he did start out as an actor, and he frequently wrote in cameos for himself to put a face to his status as the creator. But one thing Dan notoriously was not was nice. So it's a bit suspicious just how much he invested in Amanda. When her own TV pilot failed after all that, Dan came to the rescue and pitched Nickelodeon on The Amanda Show. When The Amanda Show ended, he created a new TV show for her, What I Like About You. He even propelled her film career by casting her in her first movie, Big Fat Liar. But apparently the reason he liked working with her so much was because it seemed like her parents cared more about Amanda's potential fame than about her well-being.
Amanda Bynes' parents were very hands-on with her career. Specifically her dad. A big part of that was his relationship with Dan Schneider. They carefully crafted Amanda's career.
This extra attention her father put into her career makes sense because even though Amanda's dad was a dentist, he had always wanted to be a stand-up comedian. He was living his dream through Amanda.
They decided to put the automatic teller machine into the lobby of a police station. So now when you get robbed, you don't have to wait around all day for the cops to show up.
And so when it came to exactly how Dan wanted to interact with Amanda, how they would spend their time together, her parents were completely hands-off. People have recalled Dan coming right up behind Amanda and hanging on her like a boyfriend, pressed up against her with his arms around her in front of her parents, and they didn't do anything. I mean, this is Miranda Cosgrove, but would you be okay with your kid's boss doing this to them? Like, seriously, Dan's sets were weird. I have a friend with connections to one of Dan's shows, and they confirmed that not only would kids be brought in for one-on-one meetings with Dan when their parents weren't around, but people on set also called Dan Daddy. He really wanted kids to see him like a father figure. I mean, look at who he gravitated toward to lead his shows. Jamie Lynn Spears, father was a notoriously absent alcoholic. Jeanette McCurdy, abusive mom and distant father. Victoria Justice, divorced parents. Ariana Grande, absent father. And Amanda's nightmare relationship with her parents made her a perfect fit too, especially as she aged and grew even more distance from them.
Amanda tries to run away from home, and in this moment, she turns to Dan for help. Amanda's parents are really, really upset with Dan's actions through this.
But something that didn't come up in the documentary is how, beyond the running away, according to Dan's wife, Amanda was basically living with her and Dan at 16 years old when she tried to file for emancipation. And while all of this was playing out, Dan was also changing how Amanda was portrayed on his shows. Now that she was high school aged, Dan apparently thought the content she was in could mature up too.
He thought that he should be the one to kind of usher Amanda into adulthood.
So he created What I Like About You for her, which was so much raunchier than his normal Nickelodeon stuff. I was genuinely shocked when I realized it was one of his shows. I mean, my friend told me that watching What I Like About You after school was how she learned about erections.
Aww, I love duckies. Uh-oh. Duckies are moving. Duckies are moving.
I mean, even the way sex is treated on the show is so casual and overt.
You've been together a month and you haven't done it yet? How did you get Ben to wait a month to do it? I mean, I know you got a great personality, but it's not that great.
I mean, reminder, she wasn't suddenly an adult now. At 16, Dan had her doing these supposedly comedic bits, like a whole scene dedicated to her skirt being too short, or covering her body in mud, or how about cake sitting, which is literally a porn genre. These two characters are supposed to be sisters, and yet they're smearing chocolate all over each other's boobs and turning it into chocolate mud wrestling. And if you're thinking it's all harmless comedy, you're taking it the wrong way. Well, they showed us they wanted us to think about it sexually because the wrestling ends with her boyfriend walking in and saying,
God bless America.
And just look at the comments on the videos themselves. While some people are complaining about how skimpy her clothes always are, others are suggesting how to make the scenes more sensual by having her strip fully naked or dubbing the chocolate wrestling as one of the hottest bits ever on TV. Thanks to Dan's second father status and the control he had over pretty much everything in Amanda's environment, Amanda was conditioned for all of this years before. I mean, even the shows she was on, like all of Dan's female male-led shows had hardly any parents in sight. Just look at his male-led shows like Drake and Josh and Henry Danger versus the female-led shows like The Amanda Show, What I Like About You, iCarly, or Zoe 101, where the parents are either absent, abroad, or have sent their kids to boarding school. The closest we got was Victorious with some occasional parental appearances, but for the most part, Dan's female-led shows were set in a Girls Gone Wild world where chaperones were either dopey teachers or unprepared older siblings. Consciously or not, Dan was trying to create the same environment in the show that he wanted on set. Young girls with no real traditional role models besides him, of course.
You know, sometimes parents are so dumb.
Former child actor and dancer Allison Stoner actually has a super insightful podcast called Dear Hollywood about the effect fame and acting has on children's psychological development and why so many child stars struggle with mental health, addiction, and cycles of abuse. Just like Amanda.
I'm not gonna lie, Amanda was living with Dan Schneider while Amanda and her parents weren't really, around, if you get what I mean. They weren't on good terms. It's just like, Amanda was living with Dan Schneider, and that's weird, you get what I mean? Not only was she living with Dan Schneider, but Dan Schneider was her boss. So if you really think about it, if Dan Schneider asked her to do anything, she can't really say no, bro. You're living with the guy, plus he's your boss, bro. He has every power that you can possibly imagine to either make or break your whole entire career, you get what I mean? So when you see her doing certain things, it's just like, it's crazy.
Did in adulthood. And one thing they go over is the way kids' brains encode memories.
Movies are full of intense scenes, and as a child, if I'm reenacting this, or even just pretending to witness it, I'm enrolling myself in that experience as if it's real. I couldn't separate what was mine or the characters. Remember, my brain literally couldn't separate reality from fantasy.
So it's scarily easy to normalize things for a child through exposure and repetition, like Dan did both on set and in the real world and in the shows themselves. Like going to people who aren't your parents for advice because your parents just don't get it, or valuing friendships over familial relationships. Both of those are tactics used by predators to destabilize children's support systems, so they won't go running to their mom when something sketchy happens. And then there's the more blatantly creepy things Dan was normalizing for kids like Amanda. For instance, touching grown men while you talk.
I did something special for
or having kids in close proximity physical encounters with grown-ups. That's clearly been made into learned and normalized behavior. And it stems from her boss normalizing interactions like this.
I definitely saw Amanda being very close physically with Dan. There were many times that I saw Amanda sitting behind him, hugging him, or giving him like a neck massage or whatever.
Or there's the normalization of taking drugs to improve your attitude, with Dan allegedly giving Amanda Adderall, the drug that would eventually send her to rehab, just to make her appear peppier. But also at times erratic, like in this clip.
Wow. It's hard. You know, I was gonna put you like in a little tutu or something, but you know.
Really?
No.
Or there's the normalization of being sexualized, even when they aren't old enough to understand it. And Dan had been over-sexualizing Amanda from very early on. Just look at this clip from Dan's own behind-the-scenes footage. Dan is asking Amanda about this spit-operated contraption that he wrote into the script, mind you, and keeps zooming in on her face while she talks about spitting into the machine and demonstrates where her mouth goes. I mean, even young Drake Bell seems to know the sexual implications from the uncomfortable giggling. Also, take a look at young Drake Bell here. As Quiet on Set only just revealed, this was the age that he was suffering from his own abuser on set. So yeah, as far back as the Amanda Show, Dan was hard at work creating a world where all of this, inappropriate touching and drugs and sexual jokes and absentee parents and exploitation, was all just normal for these kids. But actually, one of the weirdest and incredibly unsettling things that Dan forced into normalcy was an obsession with feet. Like a foot fetishist's fantasy, there were feet everywhere in Dan's shows, usually those of children. And it's not just for comedy, but also in totally suggestive ways.
Oh, yeah.
Yes!
Foot massages were a big thing, but also
I'm not gonna lie, bro. As a kid, I used to watch these shows, and they always used to do a whole bunch of weird stuff. Like, I used to see feet all the time, bro. Like, someone massaging feet, or, you know, the bow and arrow scene where she used the bow and arrow with the with her feet, bro. I was like, I don't know, man. I used to see feet a lot. Now it's just like, you know, now I can understand why. It's because Dan Schneider is an absolute weirdo, man.
Toe play? There were feet in ketchup, feet in fish tanks, feet shooting bows and arrows.
Feel these kids' feet. Wow, they're really soft.
There's even this shot of Miranda Cosgrove in a bathtub recreating the toe scene from the Dick Van Dyke Show, which kind of makes me feel like that was a personal favorite scene of Dan's growing up. And then in the most blatant fetishization, Ariana Grande even sucked her own toe while sitting on a bed performing for a camera in character. Nickelodeon even changed its logo to a foot for a while. But this foot fetish even extended into the audition process. On the podcast Revenge of the Sis, an anonymous caller who'd auditioned for a Dan Schneider show said,
And we flew out to LA for this audition, and when we got there, it was a bunch of kids. Once about 40 kids were selected, we were then told, take off our shoes, and that we were each going to go into a room to show the producer, who is Dan Schneider. And my agent told me, you got to just take off your shoes, just like run around in front of the camera, you know, talk about how much you love being barefoot. My mom kind of looked around and was like, this is wrong. There's just something really wrong about this.
And the feet pics didn't stop at the auditions. Alexa Nicholas from Zoe 101 recalled Dan walking around on set with a camera and literally offering money in exchange for feet pictures. And Dan even solicited feet pics from kids at home too. With his show, Sam and Cat, tweeting, right on the bottom of your foot, take a pic and use hashtag Sam and Cat Saturday. We'll retweet and follow until our fingers get sore. And just in case you're wondering, did Dan just not know about foot fetishes? Well, people are grossed out over this flirty tweet he sent to his wife in 2013. At Hungry Girl, do you want to go into our room and watch Too Cute? We have 4 on our DVR. I'll rub your feet. I'm sorry, but with all the foot pics and the innuendos and the blatant toe sucking, this just sounds like an obvious code for adult stuff. Adult activities while watching an Animal Planet show literally described as documenting infants in the animal kingdom. It just also makes all of this so much worse that not only was he normalizing all of this foot stuff, I mean, even down to keeping your feet manicured and toes painted consistently, Dan was pimping out these child actors to do all these weird fetishized acts that people pay money to see grown adults do on OnlyFans. And he was grooming them to think it's normal as early as those auditions. Think about what it's teaching your kids. If you take your shoes off and run around exactly how daddy wants you to, he'll make you a star. And since they did it in the audition, why would they be weirded out by being barefoot on set or shooting a scene with their toes? And then getting $50 for someone to take a picture of your feet starts to sound like a silly thing to get upset about. It's all conditioning these kids to A, see all these weird asks as normal, and B, focus on making Dan happy at any cost. It's totally exploiting the fact that child actors are taught to be grateful for the opportunity to even have a job. It's an industry of no's, so when you get a yes, you're supposed to keep saying yes to whatever it takes. Who's gonna say, no, never mind, I'm giving up my dream job and quitting? But where were the adults? Well, remember, parents were actively discouraged from coming on set. And then the other adults who were there to make the show were actually suffering through their own abuses.
Female writers on The Amanda Show told us that this experience was really one of the most disturbing in their careers.
Working for Dan was like being in an abusive relationship.
Now, just to set the stage, in the 90s, it was still hard for women to even get positions in writers' rooms. I mean, the Center for the Study of Women in Television and Film says only 13% of writers were women in 1998. It was actually so hard to break in as new female writers that Christy Stratton and Jenny Kilgan had to actually share a salary. And as it turns out, just like the kids, a lot of the adults on these shows were also handcuffed to this workplace as their only chance at achieving their dreams.
This was my dream job. I mean, this is what I wanted. I'm not about to turn it down.
Which means they were also at the mercy of Dan.
Dan could be very volatile. I was scared.
As the showrunner, Dan was their boss as well as someone they had to interact with daily in close quarters.
And the crazy thing about all of this is most of the women behind the scenes weren't actually being paid, bro. They were working for free simply because it was their dream job. I'm not sure if she already stated this in the video. I probably missed it, but you get what I mean, bro. Not being paid is insane. But at the end of the day, it was like a dream for them working for Nickelodeon. It was something that they really enjoyed, so they didn't really mind not being paid, if you get what I mean. But it's just like, Dan Schneider's kind of taking advantage of these women. And it's just like, you gotta pay them, bro. Like, what are you doing, man?
It's not like the other studio execs who just pop in from time to time. The showrunner's word is final on set. Well, this showrunner not only told his employees multiple times that he didn't think women were funny, he also was known to scream at people when he didn't get his way, which makes it extra uncomfortable and intimidating that this grown man who will happily scream in your face started pestering his female writers for massages. And if that's not bad enough, guess who he also asked for massages from various sources over the years? The kids on his shows too. But outside of the massages, Dan would find all kinds of ways to flex how much power he had over these women.
Scream, I'm an idiot, or slut. And if you didn't, he would send you the message again. He would scream out, say it, until you did.
And if that wasn't unprofessional enough,
Dan was showing pornography on his computer screen.
But perhaps the most disturbing was when he made a female writer pantomime sodomy to humiliate her.
Dan said, you know what would be funny? If you leaned over the table and acted like you were being sodomized. She couldn't get out of it. He's begging her. So she just leaned over the table and did what he asked her to do. It was probably the wrongest thing I've ever seen happen to a woman in a professional environment ever.
But despite the fact that Christy endured all of this torture, Dan still fired her 3 days before the end of season 1. And Jenny only lasted a few days into season 2 before being bullied into quitting. And in Dan's recent softballed interview, he seriously downplays his role in this treatment and any threats of retaliation against these women for complaining. But he completely failed to acknowledge Jenny's report of how things went down.
He had gotten caught doing something ethically wrong and said, if I find out you told on me, I'm going to do something even worse to you. You're not going to work again.
And despite knowing that her writing career would be over, Jenny went ahead and filed a lawsuit against Dan and Nickelodeon, all in hopes that it would prevent anyone from suffering the way she did. Unfortunately, while her career stalled out, Dan's kept going. After that, Dan went on to have largely, if not all, male writers' rooms. Which begs the question, if Dan hated women so much and was so convinced that they are not funny, why did the vast majority of his very comedic shows center around young girls trying to be funny? Well, that's because some things were funnier when girls were doing them, or at least they were to Dan. And a perfect and disgusting example involves Jamie Lynn Spears. While filming Zoe 101, Jamie Lynn Spears shot a scene that is so suggestive, we can't even include it in this video without it getting flagged by YouTube.
There are all these setups that reference
Yet it aired on national television on a kids show. Basically, her co-star Alexa Nicholas was supposed to squirt a goo pop at Jamie Lynn, but Dan was creepily specific about how it had to land on this 13-year-old's face. Instead of letting the goo fall where it may, they took the shot again and again, and even brought in a props person with a syringe to strategically make sure it hit her face exactly how Dan wanted it. Like, look how intentional that is, crossing her lip. And it's not like the people on set didn't know what they were going for. Jamie's castmate recalled,
"We heard the boys saying it's a shot."
Like, not only is it one big sick joke to Dan, it's as if he's making these shows for two audiences, kids and his own friends. But he's also capitalizing on the fear of being the odd one out. If you're a young girl who doesn't get a sexual joke, but everyone else is laughing, 9 times out of 10, you're just going to uncomfortably giggle and move on. You don't want to be the prude. Alexa's actually a great example, too, of how hard it was for even the best parents to keep tabs on set, because something they didn't mention in the documentary is, not only did Dan insist on sitting in on all of her wardrobe fittings,
I would hear the chair like creaking if he even breathed. Now looking back at that, it doesn't seem right because I never experienced that ever again. That was only a Dan experience.
when she's standing there in these skimpy skirts and the wardrobe person is taking photos, Dan...
He would also want the Polaroids.
Oh, that's foul.
And after Alexa got bullied by Jamie Lynn on set, Dan isolated Alexa from her mom, screamed at her that it wasn't her show, and allegedly flat out said, "Nobody likes you." That was one of his biggest defense mechanisms, fear. Fear of people hating you, of getting fired and blacklisted, fear of a grown man screaming in your face. Dan relied on the power dynamics of kids being told to listen to adults and the child actor psyche of it literally being your job to please all of the grown-ups. It's more like how a father would interact with a child than a boss interacting with an employee. And when that didn't work, there's always money. Another thing Quiet on Set didn't touch on for some reason, even though they had Alexa interviewed, was that when Alexa finally started talking about all of this as an adult, she got a call from Dan's lawyer asking her how much she needed for her to be quiet. But here's where it gets really scary. It wasn't just Dan offering hush money, it was Nickelodeon itself.
They had it in the budget. They would actually have it in the budget for hush money.
Jeanette McCurdy, who starred in iCarly, revealed in her book that Nickelodeon had also offered her hush money to the tune of $300,000. Jeanette explained that it was an attempt to silence her about her time working with Dan. Just keep that in mind as you start to see Nickelodeon's new statement popping up in articles where they profess their commitment to fostering a safe and professional workplace environment free of harassment or other kinds of inappropriate conduct. and then tell people to take money and shut up. Well, Jeanette didn't take the money, and she revealed yet another creepy depiction of Dan on set, describing times when he offered her massages, he's obsessed with massages, took a photo of her in a bikini, and despite being underage, tried to peer pressure her into drinking, explaining that he already had the Victorious cast drinking regularly and the iCarly cast needed to loosen up. But as we're seeing repeatedly with Dan, he's always strategic with his fixations. The massage requests and bikini pics and peer pressure was all much easier to push onto a girl like Jeanette, who was actively suffering abuse from her mom. When Jeanette's book came out, a spokesperson for Dan and Nickelodeon wrote it off as just being a beautiful tribute to getting the help she needed to get through the trauma she experienced with balancing her family and a high-pressured work life. In reality, Dan capitalized on the fact that Jeanette wanted time away from her mom and the fact that she had to stay on his good side to keep her job. And he wasn't wrong. Jeanette did stay quiet and probably would have remained that way without the extensive years of therapy she's gone through. Jeanette even mentioned Dan's manipulation tactics in her book, saying he does this with every new star of a show he's making. He takes you under his wing, you're his favorite. He specifically did this with Miranda Cosgrove, buddying up to her as he elevated her from a side character to a star. And let's just remember, when she started Drake and Josh and first met Dan, Miranda looked like this. But really, this repeated behavior goes all the way back to before Amanda even. The whole reason he even saw Amanda at that children's comedy showcase was because a current All That star, Katrina Johnson, was performing there. Katrina was the first girl Dan thought of making a spin-off for, literally pitching it as The Katrina Show. But once he saw Amanda, it was out with the old and in with the new.
After that, I'm sort of like edged out by like a younger version of me.
Just as quickly as you could gain Dan's attention, it could be taken away, which is an abuse tactic.
You wanted Dan to like you because if he didn't, he was mean to you.
And I know this seems like a lot of people saying they were uncomfortable, but you can actually see the discomfort in Dan's own BTS footage.
She say nice things about me? Because I will tase her if necessary.
Uh-oh.
I have the taser. We haven't had to use it in a long time. But
I said lots of nice things. These videos made me so nervous.
No. Why?
Hey,
it's too bad I didn't cast a pretty girl to play your girlfriend. Oh no. That's a little joke because you're ridiculously beautiful.
Hey.
Why are you sitting on the floor of the set?
Because we are. But the best examples of how Dan was exploited.
But I'm gonna just end this video here. Let me know what you guys think about all of this down in the comment section and subscribe for more content. Overall, Dan Schneider is a weirdo, bro. Even his cast members are completely weirded out by him. They already know what kind of person he is. You know, they're very uncomfortable, bro. Like you could tell by the clips that were just played. You know, the cast members are extremely uncomfortable. As soon as they see him, they get very uncomfortable, and they're very uneased by their I don't know what's the best way I can put this, their demeanor, I guess. I don't know, the way they're moving, the way they just automatically change, their whole mood just shifts, if you get what I mean, as soon as they see Dan Schneider. You get what I mean? But as you can tell, they already know what kind of person Dan Schneider is. So yeah, man. But without further ado though, and also the Nickelodeon is paying people off to be quiet, like hundreds of thousands of dollars, which is pretty crazy, man. And bro, now I can completely understand why some people aren't speaking out, simply because Nickelodeon's paying them off, if you get what I mean. And they're taking the money simply because most of the cast members, after their big hit show, season ends or comes to an end overall, they can't really be successful after that. It's just like they have a big problem with being successful after that. That's all they're really known for, being on Nickelodeon, right? So after they're done with that, like it's just nothing more ever goes on for them. So it's just like I guess they just take the money. But overall, bro, Amanda isn't really speaking out about this whole situation, which is crazy. But I don't know, man, who knows? But at the end of the day, yeah, like I said, let me know what you guys think, and peace out, man.